that serves all Iraqis and provides services and security of energy to future generation, one needs to not only pay attention to the technical solution, but also to the commercial and legal framework of this important sector. And for this to happen, the tariff needs to be meaningful and well balanced between consumers and producers, between the customer that uses the services and the producers who spend money in developing the power station, let it be the state or the private sector. For many years, Iraq provided electricity at heavy subsidy, and this subsidy is quite important for a specific segment of the society, specifically those with limited income and people who live in poverty. Having said that, it doesn't make any sense for such subsidies to continue serving people middle class or well off who can pay the full rate. Although it sounds a question of economic, but I'm afraid it's always seen, tariff reform is seen as a political question. Especially in this part of the world, when many people think that because we are oil and gas rich country, we should be served freely when it comes to energy resources. And this is a note of absolute selfishness, should I say, because we are the living, are not the owners of these resources. We should think of our future generations. We should think of our families. We should think of the future of this country. We live for some years and we pass away, and people come after us. We need to create a sustainable country that serves the people and future generations. And for this, we are talking about economic reform, tariff reform, and we have to think about it with responsible view for the future. With that, I don't want to talk further in terms of the details and the technicalities. I leave it to the expert to suggest solutions. And with this, I end my note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Khatib, for your kind speech. I will now invite His Excellency Kamal Mohammed Saleh, the Minister of Electricity of the Kurdistan Regional Government, to deliver his speech. Thank you.
معالي السيد وزير كهرباء العراق الفدرال
Electricity, Dr. Luay Al-Khatib. Ladies and gentlemen, dear attendees, peace be upon you all. Thank you very much for inviting us to this forum in Baghdad, and we are pleased to attend with you to discuss some of the cases with regard to the situations and the realism of the grid in the regions and how to link it with the national grid. Ministry of Electricity and the Kurdistan government always attempting and trying to find electricity sources and to distribute it fairly among the citizens living in the regions, also to cover the neighboring provinces and the regions based on the available capacities of the network, like the province of Kirkuk and province of Nineveh, and also the displaced outside Iraq and the displaced, the migrants from the other different Iraqi governments due to the ISIS attacks, and a number of the displaced and the migrants, more than 1 million and more than 2 million in the first years of 2014. of the displacements. The regions of all administrative institutions weren't negligent at all to offer assistance to the brothers. So from the very beginning, we were able to reside them, house them, and worship houses and mosques, and solidarity with their suffering and pain. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the region, based on the power generations from the very beginning in 1991 until 2000, on the predictions on the hydroelectronics and Benbirkhans, the best case wasn't exceeds 25 megawatts, and due to the storage of water. However, after the issuance of the investments government in 2006 and presenting facilities to the investors and with regards to the exemptions, tariffs, and to secure the lands in order to set up the projects and to provide them the services of water and electricity, and the projects are rose by the governments without any returns. Many of the investors, actually the local and the foreigners, applied for investments in the field of generations of electricity, and the regions, the total amounts of the regions to 6,737 megawatts, and these projects actually is now works in part of us by gas and diesels and the oil, black oil. While the request of residents getting better peaks 6,500 megawatts, means that the capacities productions may exceed the needs and reaches the hours of supplying the citizens in 2011-2013 more than 22 hours of supplying the citizens with water. However, the incidents that Iraq experienced and the region due to the ISIS attacks and other, which caused a huge number of the displaced and the migrants, more than 2 million individuals. This impacted negatively on the supply of water, electricity, education, and all the other services. The supplying of electricity to the citizens reached to 10 hours instead of 22 hours. This actually was very negative. Also cost this situation the government of the Kurdistan region more than 130 billion due to the cost of the electricity of like generations. There's a private sector, so the government has to pay to the investors, and unfortunately, I mean, the central government hasn't paid any amount with this regard. Neither the UN organizations. Also, it was also paid by the government of the region. The assistance of the huge number of the displaced and the migrants living in the region, it is the responsibility of the central governments and the international organizations, because the infrastructures of the electricity in the region, it is not up to the level to absorb this huge number of the individuals. So far, the number of the displaced, 274,000 displaced and 915 displaced. It means the total number of these people 1,040,305 individuals living in the Kurdistan regions, based on the latest statistics in July by UNHCR. Therefore, we request from your excellencies as technicians to state the status of the grids, the national grids and the grid of the regions. If it is possible to reinforce one of them to link between them, we are ready actually to provide all the facilities to make such a task a success, and to secure all the needs in order to disrupt units and to joint benefit from the two parties. Actually, this is what we have been doing, is not to enter 100 megawatts to governors of Kirkuk. We secured the needed fuels by the regions, and the cost of the investors will be paid by the central government. This is, and also to cover the Nainawa governors from 350 to 400 from the region's grid. This indicates our credibility, to have a real tangible coordination. We want to reinforce this cooperation because we are service ministries and people are in a dire need for such a service. We have many units, which are disrupted, not functioning, each one of them 125 megawatts. If it is possible to secure the fuel for these them by your sites, then we can operate them and agree agree on the distributions of the production between two ministries. And also there are studies, primary studies of different sites in the regions. We can exploit that and we can set up hydro electric projects. We can benefit from that. I mean, if it is possible to secure the requested cost for that in order to set up the dams and to generate electricity. The Ministry of Electricity at the regions always tries to control the distributions of electricity among the citizens and to put an end to the transgress of the grids by implementing the smart grid projects with the latest sophisticated technologies and the global standards. The objective here is to lessen the conceptions and to remove the violations and to improve the how to collect the cost of electricity. Thank you very much and peace be upon you. Okay. شكرا سيادة الوزير لكلمتك. الآن أدعو السيدة كومارسار لوجز مدير الإقليمي للمشرق ممثل البنك الدولي ليقدم كلمته، فليتفضل.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning everyone. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, the Iraq Energy Forum, for inviting the World Bank to be part of this event. This is my first time at the Iraq Energy Forum, and I'm really very pleased to be here. And I do want to convey on behalf of the World Bank that we have a very strong commitment for Iraq's longer-term development, peace and prosperity of this country. This country plays a unique role in the region, but also globally. And within that space, energy sector holds a very strong importance for all of us. And I have a very strong team from the World Bank group here in the audience. And one of my colleagues who's really the energy specialist is going to be in the panel later in the day, who's our practice manager for energy. I was asked to speak on electricity, the broader economic reforms in the context of Iraq. And I've been in this job for 2 years, covering Iraq, but a number of other countries in the region, and I've been following Iraq's evolution very closely. So I think my talk is going to be focused on how reforms in the energy sector in the country can really pave the directions for prosperity, more development, more job creation, more sustainable development in the countries. I think that's going to be the theme of my talk. And I do want to convey to Excellency the Minister of Electricity, Dr. Luai Al-Khatib, and also Excellency Minister of Electricity, Dr. Kamel Muhammad Saleh, our highest regards to both of you and our commitment that as you pursue these electricity reforms within your jurisdiction, we are very happy to provide whatever support we can provide from our side. So first, I think putting the context from a World Bank perspective, the energy sector is integral to the broader Iraqi economy, and I'm sure many speakers have talked about this before. Oil and gas accounts for almost 60% of the gross domestic product, 99% of the export earnings, and 90% of government's revenues. Iraqi economy is one of the most oil dependent in the world. The relationship between hydrocarbon revenues and the national budget is crucial and explains some of the broad macroeconomic pressures that have prevailed during times of revenue volatility. Government expenditure has closely tracked the movement in oil prices, rising when they were high and falling when they were low. Such pro-cyclical fiscal policy has important implications for the economy as a whole. At the low point in the recent oil price cycle, Iraq's monthly oil revenue fell to less than $2 billion, while the fiscal obligations, particularly on salaries, pensions, social spending, were more than $6 billion per month, leaving a $4 billion deficit to honor basic spending, discounting the need for expenditure on the capital projects. Iraq has financed the deficits through a mixture of increased borrowing, including from international financial institutions, and also tapping its own international reserves, which has fallen by $33 billion in 2016 compared with 2013 levels. Between 2009 and 2013, when oil prices were rising, the size of the federal budget doubled as the state increased employees and raised public sector salaries. Lower oil prices from mid-2014 forced a major fiscal retrenchment. Despite a significant year-on-year increase, in 2019 the federal budget is about 20% smaller than 2013. The previous decision to increase spending on public salaries and entitlements have proved very difficult to reverse when the revenues from oil have declined. The energy sector portfolios have not been immune to this fiscal retrenchment. The annual capital budget allocated to the Ministry of Oil, which is charged with remunerating international oil companies, was only 1/5 lower in 2015-18 period than in 2013, thus affecting Iraq's ability to pursue its long-term oil and gas development targets. The effect has been even starker in the Ministry of Electricity, where the budget for capital expenditure is down by more than 60% compared with 2013 levels. In the first 11 months of 2018, Iraq government has spent 5 times more on salaries, pensions, and social welfare than it did on capital projects. The $10 billion that it disbursed for capital projects represents only half the amount allocated in the 2018 budget. This illustrates not only the allocation is reduced, but also that it is unable to efficiently spend available capital. This is somewhat less of an issue in the oil sector, which accounted for 3/4 of the government's capital spending over the last 3 years, while the non-oil investment amounted to less than 5% of the government's total spending over the same period. Iraq also faces a profound need to develop its domestic energy infrastructure, in particular in the electricity sector. The task of doing so has been complicated greatly by the war against ISIS and by the roller coaster ride in oil prices since 2012, and the squeeze that these factors have exerted on state capital expenditure. The electricity sector's high losses, lower than cost recovery tariffs that His Excellency referred to earlier in his talk, energy paid, the lower than cost recovery tariffs and poor revenue collection represent increasing fiscal pressure on Iraq's public resources. In 2017, the electricity subsidies were estimated at $11.2 billion, including purchase of electricity from IPPs. These subsidies included $6.7 billion of lost oil exports and almost $3.2 billion of budget transfers, which is about 5% of total government expenditures. The risks of high dependence on volatile hydrocarbon revenue have prompted the authorities to renew a commitment to reform and diversify the Iraqi economy. There are some signs of progress, but this remains a huge long-term challenge for the country. How Iraq meets the expectations of a youthful and growing population in a very changing policy and market environment is a critical question, both for Iraq and the global energy markets. Let me turn to a few policy recommendations. The reform agenda for the producer economies is much broader than energy, but relies on a well-functioning energy sector. For Iraq, maintaining upstream investment and the advantages of a large, low-cost resource base are vital, but so are pricing, efficiency, and a host of changes in the electricity sector. Make an efficient, well-functioning energy sector the bedrock of a more diversified and prosperous Iraq, based on the revenues from adequate and timely investment in the upstream, a much more productive use of the nation's gas resources, and a step change in the affordability, reliability, and the sustainability of the electricity provision. Again, the point that His Excellency, Iraqi Minister for Electricity made earlier today. There is huge potential to cut network losses, which are among the highest in the world. Reducing these network losses by half would help to improve dramatically the efficiency of grid supply, effectively increasing available capacity by 1/3. On the supply side, more needs to be done to capture and put to use efficient power plants. And last but not the least, Iraq needs to take advantage of abundant renewables potential and increase the share of solar, in particular in the power mix. Let me conclude by briefly talking about the World Bank Group support and what more we could do in this country towards the implementation of the reforms that I mentioned earlier. The World Bank Group has continued to provide support in the Iraq's energy sector. Our engagement in the sector aims to support these policy objectives through several investment and technical assistance activities that aim at improving the quality of electricity services, re-establishing financial sustainability of the electricity and domestic gas sector, supporting the decentralization and corporatization of electricity services to improve accountability and the proximity of decisions and resources to the citizens. World Bank Group can offer more. In solar energy, the World Bank Group has ramped up its efforts to help developing countries accelerate their transition to clean energy in recent years, including through technological policy and financial innovation. Between the fiscal years of 2014 and 2018, the World Bank has provided more than $11.5 billion in financing for renewable energy and energy efficiency. In the past 4 years, the World Bank on average has financed 25% of all solar mini-grid projects in developing countries. Under the Climate Change Action Plan adopted in 2016, the World Bank will use multiple instruments to de-risk renewable energy investments with a cumulative target of adding 20 gigawatts in renewable energy generation. Through a combination of these policies and investments in power systems, World Bank will enable a further 10 gigawatts of renewables to be integrated into the grids. Many of these success stories are in the MENA region, including in Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, but also in Chile, Argentina, India, and elsewhere. Lessons learned indicate that countries which pursue policies based on international best practice, including transparent and competitive procurement processes, tend to attract most capable bidders and lowest prices. I want to conclude by talking about a regional initiative which may be of interest to the audience here. A key program that we are currently engaged is the Regional Energy Interconnection, which is also known as the Pan-Arab Regional Energy Trade Platform. Previous studies undertaken by the World Bank and its partners show enormous monetary benefits stemming from energy trade within the MENA region. These studies estimate that in 2013, investments needed to meet the growing electricity demand in the region could exceed $450 billion by 2020. With a fully integrated electricity grid in the region, Arab countries could reduce electricity generation capacity requirements by 33 gigawatt, or 25% by 2020, which is equivalent to the 2014 system capacity of Egypt. As for natural gas, MENA countries have 41% of the global reserves, but only 15% of the global population, and gas sector remains an underexploited resource. It is well known that the gas has the potential to address many of the region's needs, such as securing long-term supply, to promote affordable and reliable electricity, and reducing power outages that have been increasing in the region. Replacing heavy fuel oil by cleaner natural gas for power generation, as well as diversifying regions' economies and fueling their growth. However, the current situation in which Arab countries export much needed gas to destinations outside the region rather than within, it was created by a pricing scheme that enables better returns on gas imports to industrialized countries outside the Arab world. Gas trade within the region is limited to rather small volumes. In 2014, the total volume of gas traded in the Arab world amounted to 997 billion cubic meter, of which Arab countries traded about 20% of this. Now, I want to conclude by saying that Iraq, given its broader socio-economic challenges, where you have very high levels of unemployment, particularly among the youth, and given the volatility in the market, it is very important for Iraq to prioritize economic reforms, improving investment climate, attracting more private investment, and stimulate the growth. And as part of the broader economic reform program, making energy sector as a central pillar of the reform program is going to be extremely important. And we stand ready to work with the Iraqi government, the civil society, and the private sector as you embark on your new economic program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jah, for this quite insightful speech on Iraq's energy sector. I would like to invite the panelists to our first and only session for today, which will cover economic reform and development in Iraq. Our speakers will include Alia Mubayad, who's the Chief Economist at Jefferies, Ali Safa, Middle East Program Director at the International Energy Agency, Harry Stepanian, Senior Fellow at Iraq Energy Institute, and Eric Magnus, Principal Advisor with the World Bank. The session is going to be chaired by Mustafa Al-Ansari, Senior Economist at Epicorp. May all speakers and our moderator approach the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting you all. I'd like to actually say my thank you to Yasar and his team for a wonderful job they've done on this marathon event, day 4, and I'm glad to see so many of you have lasted this long. And above all, I'd also like to thank many of you, the audience, for attending today, Your Excellencies, as well. For those of you that have been here throughout, you all have heard many of the challenges that Iraq will continue to face or has been facing on the economy side, but also on the energy side as well. But at the same time, many of the achievements to date, as well as the opportunities that await us all. As I said, it's an absolute pleasure for me to be moderating this particular session on economic reform and development in my capacity as senior economist at Apicorp. Apicorp is a multilateral development financial institution with a mandate to develop the energy sectors within our member countries, of which Iraq is a founding member, but also the MENA region at large. And we do this through direct investments, debt issuance, and of course, policy advisory services. And of course, Iraq has had many difficulties, but has made significant strides. And Apicorp, amongst a host of other interested parties, is looking to really increase its foothold within Iraq. Not least for us, certainly, to develop and support the energy sector, from oil and gas to power, renewables, and other associated industries. But we cannot talk about the development and the future of Iraq without addressing some critical economic reforms that need to take place. We've already heard many times today and in the last couple of days the need for economic reform. It's no surprise, it's no secret that Iraq or hydrocarbons account for a significant portion, over 80% of Iraq's budget, or continues to account actually for over 80% of Iraq's budget, thus subjecting it or subjecting the future developments of this country to volatility, instability, and huge uncertainty. Therefore, economic diversification is absolutely of paramount importance. And as you know, we've heard the World Bank Group mentioning the importance of these diversification plans in terms of reducing unemployment rate, in terms of unleashing other sectors of the economy. But I think it's important for the government to start to tackle other dormant sectors within the country. These sectors will be critical in ensuring the sustainable long-term development of the economy. Whether it's manufacturing, agriculture, or tourism, they will all do their part in ensuring that the issue of unemployment is addressed and that the trade balance is improving as well. Unemployment, as has been mentioned, is a critical, it's a serious issue. Population growth in the country have been growing at an alarming rate. Unemployment rates amongst the youth are roughly in the sort of region of 40%. Some estimates put it at a higher figure than that. More worryingly, however, 40% of the population, that's 40, is under the age of 14. This means that the government does not have to only work diligently to ensure that the issue of unemployment is addressed today, but to ensure as well that proper and appropriate measures are taken in the future so that the next wave entering the labor force does not face similar issues. With me today, I have an esteemed panel of experts who, for most of you, need no introduction. Thank you yourself for introducing them. And hopefully in the brief time that we have, I hope that the discussions will provide us with some takeaways that we can all get back to and implement within our capacities. Ali, I thought I'd start with you firstly. I know you produced an excellent report in Iraq, which focused on the energy sector, but generally speaking, the issue of population growth is very pressing, not just in Iraq, but across the MENA region. What are the implications of us for Iraq if nothing is done on the economic reforms? The population persists to continue rising at the rate it does.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be with you all today. It's as you mentioned, I suppose, Mustafa. If you look at all of the different indicators inside of Iraq, you look at the macroeconomic indicators, you look at the fiscal indicators, all of them are quite worrying. I mean, generally, the level of dependence on oil is quite stark, even for a producer economy. Even by producing economy standards, Iraq is, it stands out as being particularly reliant on oil and gas revenues. But I suppose if you look at all the indicators, the one that surprises me and the one that worries me the most is not actually fiscal or energy related. It's the one that often has the highest level of accuracy when it comes to forecasting, and that's population growth. As you mentioned, 40% of the population over here is under the age of 14, 60% is considered youth, and you've got youth unemployment rates at around 40%, and that can be the driver of some social tensions if left unremedied. And that's the situation today. But if you look 10, 15 years into the future, which in policy terms is really not that far, the UN Population Division expects the Iraqi population to grow by around 25 million people. 25 million people. So that puts that's an infrastructure issue. That's a social welfare issue. But beyond everything, it's, are you going to be able to create the kinds of jobs that can either keep unemployment stagnant at the current rate, which is high enough, or bring it down? And you need to get ahead of that curve. It's a moving target, and it's a very difficult target to hit. If the current kind of the current status of taking that employment into the public sector, using the public sector to soak up some of that employment issue, continues, then you hit a ceiling very quickly, because already this country spends probably far too much of its budget on the current expenditure, on things like salaries and pensions. And going forward, even in a situation where you have high oil prices, that's going to be untenable. It's going to be very, very difficult to do that. So by 2030, if you keep consistent things like the unemployment rate and even salaries, you can calculate that the salary bill will increase 150% in the next 10 years. So that you're hitting a wall. So something needs to be done to create the kinds of productive jobs needed to soak up that thing. Now, the second point, and then I'll pass to the other panelists, is that because the current model has been to take up all of this unemployment into the public sector, putting a huge burden on the state. If you look at things like total factors, productivity of the labor force, productivity levels have decreased by half since the 1970s. Half. It's like this should be setting alarm bells throughout the administration, because it basically means that for every worker you have, output has diminished by half in the last 40 years. That's not only on the incorrect trajectory, it's on the incorrect trajectory at a rate that's quite worrying.
Thank you, Ali. Actually, that's a very important point you mentioned there. Eric, the World Bank has long-lasting experience of working with many countries and implementing their reform programs. No doubt there are certain things within the reform agenda that you can apply on some of these countries. You've taken the lessons learned and you know what works and what doesn't. What do you feel is unique when it comes to Iraq? What are the main economic reform plans that need to be sort of considered, certainly in the short to medium term? Ali mentioned productivity going down. Some of these issues perhaps need to be addressed from now to ensure long-term productivity improves. But what do you see sort of as a timeline of reforms that need to take place to tackle some of the most pertinent issues regarding the current state of the Iraqi economy?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And I've attended with great interest some of the great sessions during the last few days. And I think that if you just took the words of Captain of Industry and some of the big investors in this country, we would believe that all of Iraqi's energy problems could be solved by just investing ourselves out of the problem. I think that is a mirage. It's a very important component, and we desperately need private sector entrepreneurship and innovation as part of the solution. But if we look at similar countries that have gone through similar development cycles, we need to turn the value chain around. We need to start with the consumer and look at what service is provided in Iraq today. And why is the business chain or the value chain of the Iraqi electricity sector not working and providing the value that small businesses, households are needing? Let's first maybe look at the dollars and cents. My director mentioned a few, but just to repeat, we are today collecting about 10% of the cost of producing power in Iraq. For every additional megawatt, 90% need to be paid for by the budget. That is resources that are taken out of other productive uses, etc. That's not a sustainable model, obviously. If you break that down, 40% of that revenue is lost before it's billed, and half of the billing is not collected. So a lot of the issues in the electricity sector in Iraq stems from the distribution sector. And you can argue, why are consumers not paying the bills? Why are they not even receiving one in some cases? Part of it is also a broken relationship with the consumer. Are we giving the services? Are the consumers feeling that they are being respected as a critical foundation of this sector? We ran the numbers. The tariff in Iraq to cover all these losses would be at 22 cents a kilowatt hour if we would be cost reflective, which is clearly completely impossible for any consumer in Iraq to pay, and would be the highest tariff in the region and then some. However, if we address some of these issues, if we start collecting about 90% of the bills, and if we reduce losses to 10%, that cost recovery bar comes down to 10 cents, so less than half. So this is something that is relatively achievable. So we started looking at that and how we could support the government. And we have anchored our program around Law 53 that was passed a few years ago, which really talks about the decentralization of decision-making and accountability in the Iraqi electricity system. The movement of the key decisions to the regions, the corporatization of the directorates, and we as the World Bank believe in that, because we know that the closer these decisions are to the cities, to the regions, it's not about, you know, tribalism or faction. It's about consumers feeling that they have somebody to call, that they know that people are held accountable and that decisions are not taken 1,000 miles away in obscure political processes, but based on the decision and the business that is close at hand. So that comes to, I think, that one of the key aspects that we are active supporting the government is the aspects of decentralization. So we have started with the southern region in Iraq, and I will not embarrass you with my pronunciation of your districts, but if you look at the southern directorate and the governorates that it includes, we believe that there is an enormous potential to rapidly increase the delivery capacity and improve the quality of the delivery, and at the same time sort of forge a new social contract, if you will, with the consumers in Iraq for a worthy service, worthy of also a payment in return. So I think that some of these actions need to go along with more classic tariff reform. We cannot put the sort of the price before the product. We have to produce a product that is worthy of the price. And that's very much what we are focused on. Another aspect that has been mentioned in terms of economic development is to draw on some of the neighboring countries to Iraq and see how Iraq can expand on the power trade. We know and we work with almost all of the neighbors around Iraq, and we know that several of them are producing surpluses. In fact, some of them are even producing surpluses that they have to pay through rather costly take-or-pay agreements. So there is now a clear win-win paradigm development in a region where Iraq could quickly, when the infrastructure in place, draw on some of the already developed infrastructure in the region, be more interconnected, create more stability for our grid, and more rapidly move up on the development chain. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Ali, I'm going to come to you in a second. Actually, there was something that Eric mentioned towards the end I think maybe Ali you can shed a bit more light on, because I recall a report that you produced last year on producer economies, and there was a chart that, if I'm not mistaken, for Iraq, that showed on one side the percentage of hydrocarbons exports as a percentage of total exports against revenues or hydrocarbon revenues. And I think in both instances, that figure was above 80, 90, even 100%. How does that compare to other producer economies in the region?
Well, yeah, I recall very well that chart that we produced last year, and it's as you say, it was oil and gas as a percentage of total exports and oil and gas as a percentage of total revenue, and Iraq was right on the top far corner. It was, like I said, you know, in my opening statement, it's the fact that Iraq, even by the standards of this region, the producers of this region, is quite extreme. The dependence is extreme by energy dependent standards, and that's where the tension is. And it's as our colleague from the World Bank mentioned in his opening speech, and as is mentioned in our book that we released earlier this year. It's It's the pro-cyclicality of it. If you look at the investments, the capital expenditures being made even in the energy sector, because of the fact that it's so pro-cyclical and there's essentially no counter-cyclical policies in this administration. You have, when oil prices are high, capital expenditure going through the roof. When they're low, they plummet. And so even in the oil ministry, their capital expenditure has decreased by 60% on average since the 2014 crash. So that's a big matter of instability. But I just wanted, if I may, while I have the microphone, to comment on something that Magnus said, which is the fact that 22 cents per kilowatt hour for cost recovery is high by regional standards. Fair enough. But in many Iraqi households, they're paying multiples of this, but they're paying it for a fraction of the electricity produced. Because when we ran the numbers and we found that the some Iraqis were paying 25,000 Iraqi dinars per ampere for their neighborhood generator, that translates to $1,200 per megawatt hour. So, it's not uncommon for an Iraqi household to pay $250, or a middle-class Iraqi household to pay $250 to $300 a month for the electricity they are provided, when you look at it in total. Mm-hmm. So, to increase the level of service, and this is our contention. If you say that we can only do the tariff reform at a time when the level of service is increased, then in fact, maybe how are you going to generate the revenues to improve the service in the first place? So breaking that chain is vital. And in our estimation, if you tackle tariff reform at the same time as you're tackling the regulation of the neighborhood generators, that's one key. And I'll end with this. We're coming into the months where this can be done. Yep. The summer peaks are going to pass. The grid can probably, it will probably be able to supply a much larger percentage of the household need than in the summer months. So, time to get the skates on, I suppose.
Thank you, Ali. Actually, you mentioned something very important there, which is doing more than just one thing at a time. Alia, at Jefferies, I'm sure you face some of the same challenges that we face at Sapicorp when we're looking at the countries and we're trying to finance and invest. And when we look at the case of Iraq, there are multiple sort of pillars that we need to sort of cover very carefully, ensure that they tick the box. But in Iraq, it seems as though we have issues on all of them. What do you see as the main impediment to investment to Iraq? Is it the geopolitical environment? Is it governance? Is it security? Is it reform? Is it a combination of all of them? And what do you see as the most important thing for you for investment to really ramp up?
Thank you, and thank you again, Mr. Lai, for inviting me to participate. It's always a pleasure to come to Baghdad. I think it is very important, in response to your question, to remember where is Iraq, where has it come from, and to understand that we are here because, not only because of the sort of having lived through a prolonged period of conflict and spillovers from neighboring conflict, but I think primarily when I look at the resource base of Iraq, it is a matter of policy choice, whether intentionally or not, that the people of Iraq and those who have governed this country for a long time have taken in terms of how do we want to manage our resources and where do we want to specialize. And if we are here stuck at this very high level of dependence and a host of these problems, it's because I think we fundamentally chose to use Iraq's hydrocarbon wells over the past decades in constant, basically, conflict, trying to deal with the aftermath of continued conflict and say that this oil in the future, the emergence of a diversification strategy will actually take care of itself. something will happen in the future so that we will be diversifying away ourselves. I mean, I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong or right. I mean, having chosen stability in the short term and specialization in oil versus basically doing the much harder reform, and particularly institutional and other reform, is certainly a choice, particularly when we compare Iraq to other I think, resource-rich countries. Actually, if you look at the World Bank research, the IMF research, McKinsey, IEA, etc., you actually see that successful countries who have diversified have done things concomitantly, i.e., they have basically specialized and went and deepened into the value chain within the energy sector itself, but at the same time worked on what we call the enablers for diversification. They did not focus on basically what I am exporting or what is the product, but rather, do I have the policies and the institutions right that would allow me to adopt the reforms and to attract the private investor, to provide a proper safety net to target those poor when I want to increase the electricity tariff. And I think it is a reality today if you look both at institutional indicators, governance indicators in Iraq, but also complaints we hear from both public and private sector, but also development partners, but also investors that I talk to in the markets. It is a fact that those indicators are at their lowest. I mean, business environment indicators, Iraq stands at 171 out of 190. But actually, this is not the issue. The issue is that really when you look at the component of these, you realize that it is about getting access to credit, which makes you think that, okay, then there is a banking sector that has not been reformed for the past few years, and that there is a state-owned dominance in this sector that is preventing credit to GDP from going beyond 9%, which is incredibly low by any standard. So when you look at these details and at indicators, my belief, and I'm happy to discuss more, is that the issue is that of investing in policies and institutions. That is what Iraq has been neglecting for a long time, as I say, intentionally or unintentionally because of the circumstances, and I think this is where the focus needs to be doubled and tripled with the help of institutions and partners both in the public and private sectors, and of course the World Bank, who we have example and present here, is certainly has done this with many other countries that faced similar problems as Iraq.
Thank you, Alia. Some of the numbers you mentioned there are certainly quite alarming, and I know this is something that's it's not new. It's something we've known about for a while. Often when we talk about reform, there's always this notion of the sensitivity of introducing reform and how this might impact the population and some of the risks that are associated with it. But it seems from some of the discussions and what we've been hearing today that some of them seem to be no-brainers for in terms of how the public will perceive it. When the public is paying such high rates for electricity, you would think that they would welcome some of these reforms because the impact, you know, it can effectively be translated quite soon. It's not a long-term thing that you have to wait for the sector to evolve, and, you know, a medium to long-term benefits will be realized following sort of short-term pains. So actually, Harry, I think this is a good opportunity for you to perhaps share with us some of the slides that you prepared for us on the reform, I believe, of the electricity sector. So yes, by all means, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mustafa. In fact, I just remembered one famous quote by the engineering management author, Peter Drucker. He said, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. So I'll show a few figures actually on the slides so people will have better understanding why we need the electricity tariff reform. Thank you. So thank you very much, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen. I'll show you a few quick slides. I was told I have 5 minutes for this, so I won't take very long. In fact, this is what I wanted to show you first, that the electricity tariff reform is a combination of many parameters. The most important one, whether it is technically sound, economically feasible, and politically supportable. Even if we achieve the first two, if there's no political will, the reform doesn't happen. I just wanted to go through quickly where we are right now regarding the electricity sector in Iraq, so you can have a full picture of why we need to reform the sector. This is a graph showing how much generation we have produced over the last 5 years and how much the demand was, and the increase per year. It's around 12%. But remarkably, the ministry has done a very good job since 2005, increased from 5 gig to 19 gigawatt, and the credit goes to the new minister, Mr. Louay Khatib, of course. This is quite a few fiscal facts about the Ministry of Electricity right now. The approved operational budget is around 4.45. For the investment is around 4, so in total it comes to $8.5 billion a year. This shows the actual budget and the deficit budget. As you can see, the orange is the deficit. It's much bigger, or very close to what is needed by the Ministry of Electricity to implement their program, yearly program. What happens actually, due to this deficit, people tended for years, I think it's 15, 16 years by now, go to the neighborhood generators, and the market created for the neighborhood generators, according to some sources, is 4 billion. The figure that I heard in some other sources is reaching to 7 or 8 billion a year. In fact, if you can see that the average Iraqi household is paying around $300. That's much higher than what is in most of the countries, where the electricity bill should not exceed 10% of the household income. This is a figure that shows how much is the electricity consumption per capita per year for Iraq. As you can see, it's around 684 kilowatt hours per year. It's much less what the other neighboring countries except Egypt. This does not reflect really the needs of the population in Iraq. We expect that the actual need for the Iraqi economy right now is something between 2,500 and 2,700, very close to what is in Iran and Turkey. And the interesting thing, the electricity consumption per capita per person in Iraq is equivalent to what one fridge consumes a year. This figure shows the technical and non-technical losses for Iraq. You can see the figure is 54% or more than 54%. That's a very high figure, and Iraq is one of the countries on the top of the list of the highest technical losses, electricity losses in the world. This is the number of the consumers. We have 4.5 million right now. Number of the households is about 3/4 of this, of the users, and about 10%. I think the figure is more than 10% for the illegal consumers connected to the grid right now. In terms of the electricity losses, we have two types in Iraq, technical, non-technical. The most important one that is mainly affecting right now the budget, the ministry's budget, is actually the non-technical losses, and this we're talking about the fiscal. Here we can see the losses
it's clear that this issue came out immediately after the 2003 invasion. Before that, those figures coming from the World Bank, of course, you can see that since 2003, the figure has increased from 6.1 to 30% and kept rising. Where we are in the world, actually, you can see Iraq is the fourth largest, has the fourth largest energy losses or electricity losses in the world, after Togo, Libya, Haiti, and so on. In terms of the neighboring countries, you can see that 54% that I was showing to you is like 4 times higher than the neighboring countries like Turkey, Iran, Kuwait, and so on. In terms of the provinces, the biggest losses, you can see it's in Baghdad and Basra mainly. So if the ministry targets those 2 big consumers, I think half of the problem can be solved. What other countries have done before, this is one example I'll give you from New Delhi Power Limited, the utility company. They dropped down the power losses from 53% in 2002 to 15% in 2009 due to the measures that they have taken, the ones that I have mentioned here. This is a graph that shows you what we call the increasing block tariff. This is what is now we have in Iraq. We have certain blocks, and the tariff increases as the consumer uses more electricity. As you can see at the top, the residential tariff starts of less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour and goes up to 10 cents. Even that 10 cents, which is on the top side. Okay, I think even when we look to that figure, it's lower than the other countries. Can we go back, please? Back again, please. Thank you. Yeah, stop there. Yeah, thank you. As you can see, those incrementals, even if we look to them, they are much less than what we have in the neighboring countries, except, of course, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, where we have heavy subsidies as well to the electricity sector. But when you compare it to other countries, I just put down there countries like South Africa, Nigeria, UK, US. You see that what the tariff is in Iraq is much less than in the other countries. Really, when we need to talk about the tariff reform, before we start talking about it, we need to talk about something about the cost minimization. If we don't talk about cost minimization, actually we cannot just go and increase the tariff. And then the next step will be the tariff setting, and the third stage is improving the collection. I like this figure very much because it shows you what are the mutual obligations of the government and the utility companies in Iraq and the consumers. And before we go and we increase the fees, in fact, the government or the utility companies, they have to do their own homework as well. So that will include everything upstream of the billing or the collection. That includes improvement in the generation side, transmission side, and the distribution side in order to come with a realistic figure. So the problem that we have with the incremental block tariff right now in Iraq is because of, although most of the people are benefiting from this, we are not distinguishing the low-income households from the people who can afford to pay the price. This slide, I put it down here in order to show that the problem is multidimensional. In order to do the tariff reform, we have to consider the regulation, commercial, technical, training, community engagement, and information technology. All those elements need to come together in order to implement a successful reform. I'll leave you there because I have elaborated those, but I think I'm running out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry, for your presentation. As always, this is the first time I actually attend the Iraq Energy Forum, but every year I monitor the website very carefully for when they upload the presentations, because yours in particular is one that is very up to date and very useful and has a lot of very rich material. So thank you for that insight. You mentioned a lot of technical challenges, and it seems to me that potentially some of those technical challenges can be solved. It's not an engineering issue. Potentially it's not even a financial issue, but it's really highly contingent on much needed reform. And even at the end, that last slide that you highlighted on the different areas that you need to focus to carry out an appropriate reform is not exclusive to the electricity market, but I'm sure is mirrored across all the other sectors as well. I wanted to, just before we wrap up, ask a few more questions, and I'll ask them a little bit up front now so you can prepare them. I want to get away from electricity. Eric, I was wondering, I mean, I know your focus is on energy, and I know a lot of the reform plans are often they're sort of skewed more towards energy reforms as opposed to other reforms that need to take place. And Alia, perhaps you can talk about institutions a little bit as well. How important is energy reform in the context of other reforms? Is it really the priority? Are there any other linkages with other sectors? Sometimes often reforms are done in a certain sector, but that might have a negative impact on others. I don't know if you see any crossovers in other sectors as well. So before I come to start with you, Ali, the other thing I see is that, you know, these reforms are implemented with a certain view of the future. What do you think the risks are going forward, given the possibility of a different trajectory for demand? And Alia, perhaps you can talk about the importance of institutions, or particularly weak institutions that you said you wanted to sort of elaborate on a little bit more. Eric.
Well, thank you very much. I think your question is, let me divide it up. I think that there's the obvious answer of the role of the energy sector in a developing economy. I mean, it is the lifeblood of industry, of commerce, of production, etc. And I think we all know that, otherwise we hopefully shouldn't be in this conference. But I think that in Iraq, I think we have to look at both sides. It plays also a huge negative role in the fiscal balance of the state and the ability to allocate scarce government resources to other things. So, you know, it should be a positive driver, and that's where we want to get to. But I think that we also have to acknowledge that part of the problem and the need for tariff reform are not all on the productive side, but also about evening out allocation of resources and the mismatch of fiscal resources that are being, you know, used really to cover inefficiencies, which is never a good factor of growth in the first place. So I think that when we talk about losses, when we talk about tariff policy, when we talk about reform of state-owned enterprises in the sector, we have to look at that. We need to look at government efficiency of government spend. We need to look at sort of the main pillars of growth and the sentiment in the country in terms of the role of the state. And then we need to come to sort of the more classic growth inducing ingredient, which means an integrated industrial policy, a domestic energy sector that trains and brings out innovation in Iraq, which is kind of the direct generation of jobs. But as we all know, energy is mostly an indirect creator of wealth and growth, and that's really where the key is, I think. But just to finish, I wanted to maybe link back to the last session on Tuesday in the conference around the role of renewables. And I think that when we show these rather ugly gensets that we have all over Iraq, I mean, if we look at the direct job creation in the US and in the OECD countries these days from the renewable energy sector, and the type of jobs that are created, which are easily captured in Iraq as well, installer jobs, technicians, engineers, it's actually a lot more direct economy driver than the old-scale energy sector, which had very limited job creation effect and a lot of capital spent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just running off that, actually, in our analysis that you should all have at the moment, we show that if you can bring in this solar and actually bring it in a lower cost than the current system cost available today. But your question on alternative energy futures, and it comes back to what Harry was saying, is if you cannot measure the risk, then how can you react to it? There is, of course, I mean, there's an outlook for energy that says oil demand will continue growing till, say, 2040, because petrochemicals demand is growing and all the rest of it. But we cannot be, completely blind to the possibility that energy demand or oil demand globally doesn't continue growing, that it plateaus and that it falls. So if you're looking at what the world is speaking about, the energy transition, oil demand will have to plateau very, very soon, and it would need to fall all the way to 2040. And what that would mean is, of course, if there's lower demand, then you have lower prices. Under such a situation, which is not a million miles away, we've got COP26 coming up next year, and people are supposed to, or countries are supposed to resubmit nationally determined contributions. It's not a million miles away. For a country that's this reliant on energy exports, there are two things you need to consider. The first is that oil revenues going forward might be weaker than what they were in the past, especially when you consider it on a per capita basis, having said what I said about the population increases. And the second is that it means that the reforms need to start now, that you need to have other revenue generators, because you cannot even rely on your existing revenue generator. Not necessarily. I mean, if I was a policymaker in a country this oil dependent, this would probably be keeping me up at night, because you have to plan for every eventuality. And if there are no other options, then there's going to be some serious trouble. Just to put a number on it, under our scenarios going to 2040, if there is a sustainable development target being met, then oil demand falls to around 70 million barrels a day from around 105 million barrels a day. So that 35 million barrel delta would imply a relatively large downward pressure on prices.
Alia, feel free to comment on what they've touched on, or...
No, I just wanted to put a little bit everything together, because what we are hearing across, the different intervention is that basically there is some long-term challenges, but there are also very imminent, basically, threats. And those imminent threats is obviously first the unsustainable path of the fiscal deficit, right? I mean, we have seen after a very good performance in 2018, a pressure and on the government and on the political class to basically adopt expansionary budgets in 2019. Already the choices that the government of Iraq has taken to raise wages will bring wage to GDP in Iraq to 17%, one of the highest in the world. But actually what is more worrying is that, and when you are asking me what do investors are concerned about, is that they get concerned when they read that actually the 2020 budget in Iraq is going to be even more expansionary, and that commitment to curb these wage increases, or even to tame the allowances or put caps on wages. There are many different ways to manage a wage bill, are actually not necessarily on the table now, and that as you look into the dynamics of fiscal and external sustainability, particularly in a volatile oil environment, becomes problematic for Iraq. So really getting a fiscal, a medium-term fiscal framework in which basically the government announces both to the Iraqi citizens as much as it is for private investors, but also for bondholders who are buying Iraqi debt in the market, that this is the plan to basically increase non-oil revenues over the next 3 to 5 years. This is how we plan to raise electricity tariff, as we heard from Mr. Al-Khatib now. And these are the implications and the amount of savings we are going to have, and this is how we can see the impact on the budget in the next 3 years. There's no reason for Iraq not to be able to do that when this is what we are seeing all over across the region, from Bahrain to Egypt, maybe only Lebanon, and I'm Lebanese, we are not doing our job properly. So this is very important to anchor investor confidence in the fiscal path. The other more I think, very important threat, because we heard basically that there is just enough in the public purse to basically either create job or fund those tremendously large investment needs, is really ensure that we accelerate the reforms to improve the business environment, and at all fronts. And I think Iraq can look at many, many examples where, when countries were so much in the low in terms of their ranking in doing business indicators, there were emergency measures taken, like interministerials, emergency task force that could work across the government and make sure that insolvency laws are approved, the issues of collecting taxes become more efficient, trading across borders, customs become even more streamlined. So these have to be taken at the highest level of the hierarchy in government, and this is how you give both a boost of confidence and basically, provided that you deliver, give a credibility for your policy announcement. And maybe the last thing I would say, and I think this is something that the Central Bank of Iraq has started in cooperation with the IMF, is really again work on ensuring a conducive environment for financing the private sector. I mean, today, most of the liquidity of the banks is going to fund the government. And this is why, and interest rates are high, this is why you see credit to GDP is very low. So where will the private sector get its financing? You need more space for private sector banks. You need to clean the balance sheet, recapitalize state-owned banks. So the agenda is here very important in order to provide the financing that is both needed for entrepreneurship and SMEs that are job creating in this youthful environment, but also to complement and provide the financing needed to co-finance public projects, and particularly in infrastructure.
Thank you, Alia. Very important and useful remarks there. I actually like to end the session with what I've started, which is coming back to this issue of high population growth rates, huge unemployment rates, particularly amongst the youth. I know it's quite cliche to keep talking about jobs, but the reality is, in a country like Iraq, it's even more pressing. Alia, you've mentioned certain areas that you feel are important to ensure that the issue of job creation is tackled. Eric, some may disagree with energy experts as to whether energy is the right platform to create jobs. I recall a report by Irina that actually highlighted that perhaps even the indirect jobs associated with energy are not as high as perhaps other sectors in the economy. So, I mean, if I may, just to hear one final remark, very short, very crisp, one takeaway on recommendations or things that could be implemented to ensure that some of those important issues around job creation, or the quality of the jobs created, the longevity. We're not just talking about short-term jobs, we're not talking about government jobs, we're talking about important jobs that take people out of chronic poverty, that are important for the economy. What would you say, I mean, you can go back to energy and prove me wrong by all means, is the most important. We'll come back and end with you, Ali, if there's anything different from what you've already mentioned.
Well, thank you for putting me on the spot on this. I mean, look, it's a difficult question, but I think that a lot of my fellow panelists has mentioned key ingredients here, right? So if we look at the direct jobs in the sector, I think we need to start building an Iraqi mid-cap and small-cap energy or electricity private sector. I don't see enough small companies here. I don't see enough Iraqi solar companies, enough Iraqi installation companies that are, in that space, and could possibly access to finance, could possibly be policies in terms of procurement or access to markets. And I think that more broadly in the economy, I mean, we have seen the difficulty. I mean, you may be aware of one of the bank's sort of flagship products are the Doing Business report that I think is due to come out next month again. And we will have a look at what the Iraqi rating will be. There's a key indicator there on getting electricity. And I think that many countries that are struggling with job creation, strangely enough, I mean, getting electricity shouldn't be that difficult an indicator for a company that arguably should be paying their bills to get. But it takes hundreds of days in many cases, right? There's an eon of red tape in really just receiving service for the productive part of the economy. So I think that we need to look at our role. If we are the engine, if we are the lifeblood of the economy, we also need to focus on service to that economic force and treat small and medium enterprises in the best way possible.
So effectively what you're saying is that even if the job intensity or the intensity in terms of created employment in the energy sector is not high, the need for the energy is required to create jobs in other sectors of the economy.
The development economics have, I mean, I don't think there is any economy in the world that has taken a leap into sort of medium to high income that hasn't, had a working and driving energy sector behind it, right? It's an absolute imperative. It's not the only factor, obviously, but it's absolutely key. But I think that it is not driven by, large cap companies and multinational. It needs to be driven by the domestic economy, by the medium and small size enterprises and their access to this vital resource.
What's coming to my mind right now is actually a very important issue, which is the quality of service. Unless people will see an improvement in the quality of service, the consumers will see a better service in terms of supplying the electricity and, in cases of interruption and so on, there will be a fierce resistance to any tariff reform in the future. The other thing that is important, and I think I mentioned briefly, is the community engagement. I think the councils, the people representatives, tribal sheikhs and others, they have a major role to participate in preparing their communities to this change in the tariffs, and how they can convince people that, look, this is a commodity and you need to pay for it. It's like anything else you are going to buy from the market. You need to pay for what you get.
So I don't need to explain to you, Mustafa, that when you're talking about these larger issues of reform in this region, especially among the producers, it's not an economic issue solely. It's a political issue, it's a social reform issue, and all the rest of it. You tackle all three at once. It has to be done concurrently. And I'm not going to pretend like the energy sector is going to hold the key to all of these reforms. Of course, I completely agree with what my colleague said about the fact that electricity is an enabler for secondary kind of industrial growth. But there's one element that I'd like to highlight of particular waste in Iraq, that could stimulate some of the kind of SMEs, energy intensive SMEs, that could create jobs, and that's gas. Currently, we flare quite a lot of gas in this country. We import less than we flare, but we import quite a lot. And the gas that we do flare is very ethane rich. Now, obviously, ethane as an enabler of the petrochemicals facility can solve one of your issues, which is diversifying revenue. It doesn't create the jobs that you need. But what it does do is, if you do have that gas, it can anchor some of the industries that will start to employ people, you know, small manufacturing plants and things like this. And so that's the area that I'd like to focus on, in as much as the energy sector can create direct employment.
Well, I think that the elephant in the room that is preventing creating employment in this country is the size of the public sector. And I go back to this point, is that we need to work hard to reduce it and to streamline it and to make it more efficient over time, so that it is an enabler for private sector growth. And I think most important sometimes for particularly for small Iraqi companies, whether in the electricity or others, is really sort of whether we have the proper what we call public financial management systems that allow for competition in public procurement, given that this is an economy that is dominated by the public sector. Well, at least we need a procurement system where companies that want to bid for these large projects can compete competitively in a transparent manner, and that this could get the best cost efficiency for the state itself. I think that is key, and once you have this, you then would encourage, and if you add also to the law that you need to bring in local content for it, so that's also a very important conducive to letting small and medium Iraqi enterprises partner with other big foreign or Iraqi enterprises to enter into the bids.
Thank you, Alia. Well, I don't think there's anything much for me to add to that. I think they were all very, very valid and useful points, and I hope that many of you have taken away from this session as much as I have, and I'd like you all to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, please. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank the panelists for quite interesting, insightful, and informationful session that we just had. We have come to the part of this forum where we present an award for those who contribute to Iraq's energy sector. The Iraq Energy Annual Award this year, as Dr. Luay has informed us in the morning, will be awarded to Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today. I'm going to invite Mr. Adnan Al-Janabi to give us the reasoning why Iraq Energy Institute has chosen Dr. Birol to be our awardee for this year. He's the first non-Iraqi to be awarded this prestigious award. May Mr. Adnan approach the podium. Thank you.
Good day, everybody. It's always difficult to say goodbye, but since this is our last session for the 5th Energy Forum. We are going to present this year our award to, as Yasar said, to a non-Iraqi. Our first awardee was Dr. Fadl al-Chalabi, followed by an award to Jabbar al-Aibi, then Thamar al-Ghadban, and then to my humble person. Why Fatih Birol? First of all, Fatih Birol started his studies in Istanbul, Turkey, and then completed master's and doctorate in Technical University of Vienna. He also studied at Imperial College in London for later postgraduate studies. Fatih Birol started for a short stint with OPEC, then moved to the International Energy Agency, and after 20 years of rising star as he was appointed a director of International Energy Agency. Fatih Birol was appointed as director of the International Agency in 2015 and was renewed in 2018. Fatih Birol played an important part in transforming the International Energy Agency from its inception in 1974 as an adversary of OPEC, with contrasting two agencies, two organizations, one for the producers, OPEC, and one for the consumers, International Energy Agency, and we went through a conflicting period between producers and consumers. But Fatih Birol, and with the changing international environment on energy, Fatih Birol opened up the International Energy Agency with efforts mostly on his part to include developing countries and important consuming countries like Brazil, China, Indonesia, Mexico, and South Africa. Fatih Birol was nominated by Forbes magazine among the most influential energy personalities in 2017, and the Davos Forum. He joined the Davos Advisory Board, and he played a very important role in the international energy environment. Why we in Iraq want to celebrate this international personality? First of all, the Institute has been engaged with the International Energy Agency with Fatih Birol long before we started this forum. But it's important to mention that in 2012, under the auspices of Fatih Birol, the International Energy Agency in 2012 completed the Iraq Energy Outlook after work which engaged Iraqis and international experts to present that outlook. And today, I think some of you have seen this report, Iraq's Energy Sector, a Roadmap for a Brighter Future. So Fatih Birol, our friend in the Institute, but also a very important contributor to understanding energy sector in Iraq, past, present, and the future. And this is why we are honored and pleased to announce Fatih Birol as our annual awardee for our annual award. I think since Fatih Birol is not here, I will call on Ali Safar to receive the award on his behalf. sir, we have something on behalf of Fatah Birol, I think.
Thank you very much to Mr. Adnan Al-Janabi, our Vice Chairman, also to Ali Safa for kindly receiving the award on behalf of Dr. Fatih Birol. Of course, Dr. Birol, as I said, couldn't be with us today, so he kindly did record a video to play to the audience in support of the Iraq Energy Forum and also in recognition of the Iraq Energy Award. We will see this video right now. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As many of you know, I was on my way to Baghdad when the news about the major incident in Saudi Arabia broke. This major crisis required my return back to IEA headquarters, where I am now, in order to monitor the situation, the serious situation, and oversee a possible IEA response. I very much regret for not being able to participate in the very important event which I was looking forward to join, namely Iraq Energy Forum. I had always told my colleagues, Deputy Prime Minister Ghadban, Power Minister Mr. Al-Khatib, that I find the initiatives to reform the Iraqi energy market of critical importance for the Iraq's people's prosperity, for Iraq's economy, and for the region. And therefore, I wanted to say that the reforms, the initiatives put forward by Dr. Luay Al-Khatib, the Minister of Power of Iraq, is of crucial importance and enjoys mine and International Energy Agency's full support. We have been working on the electricity sector in all countries around the world since decades. Based on this extensive experience, I can tell you that these reforms, these initiatives in the power sector are very important, and if implemented fully, it can provide multiple benefits to Iraq's economy. My colleague, Mr. Ali Safar, will soon read my speech. You will hear that the arguments, the justifications of this new step to reform the electricity sector in Iraq is very important and very timely. We have full support for this new initiative. Finally, I am honored to accept the prestigious award of the Iraq Energy Institute. Some of you know, I hope many of you know, that over a decade, International Energy Agency and myself, first as the chief economist and now as the head of the International Energy Agency, we are doing a lot to support the economic development of Iraq, this beautiful country. And I am very happy that these efforts are acknowledged in this beautiful way. I thank you very much, and I wish all of you a very good day in Baghdad today. My best regards from Paris.
Well, while Dr. Birol is not with us, and his thoughts and words are, we would like to thank him for his kind speech. I'm going to invite, as Dr. Birol has told us in the video, Mr. Ali Safa, Middle East Program Manager at the IEA, to deliver Dr. Fatih's speech. Thank you, Ali.
very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I regret that I could not be with you in Baghdad today at this important event hosted by the Iraq Energy Institute. I was last here in April and I was delighted to move freely around the city. The safety and security is above all else the most heartening thing to see and opens the window towards growing the prosperity that the Iraqi people need and deserve. The energy sector will in many ways be key to this. On my last visit, I told the Prime Minister, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister, that the energy world has looked on in admiration as Iraq managed to double its oil production over the last decade, while contending with the three simultaneous challenges of lower prices, the war against Daesh, and the skyrocketing of US crude production. Since 2012, Iraq has accounted for 1 in every 5 new barrels of oil coming into the world market. In this regard, we can say that Iraq's oil production is beginning to properly reflect the country's huge potential. But ladies and gentlemen, not all the news is good. A country as wealthy as Iraq in natural resources of oil, of gas, and of solar power should not have to rely on imports to meet its energy needs. From all perspectives, it is in the Iraqi national interest for this issue to be rectified. And the actions being taken by their excellencies Minister Ghabban and Minister Khatib point to a remedy for this situation. Recently, there have been encouraging signs of improvement in gas capture in Basra, with the volumes now being utilized in the Basra Gas Company being used for power generation. We welcome these improvements, and in the IEA's estimation, over the next 20 years, no country in this region adds more associated gas production than Iraq does. This is good news not just for what it means to the power sector, but also for the domestic industries that natural gas can stimulate and that can provide jobs and economic vigor beyond the energy sector itself. The area that I would like to focus on today is the electricity sector. Here too, there have been some notable improvements, with the Ministry of Electricity successfully increasing generation by around 3.5 gigawatts this year alone. But demand has also grown by a staggering 10%, and this highlights the serious challenge going forward. What it means is that it will be nearly impossible to solve Iraq's electricity shortages by adding new generation alone. A holistic approach that considers both electricity supply but also demand needs to be taken. On the supply side, it's very much an issue of bringing in more generation and investing more in distribution to bring down the huge losses in the system. But and currently Iraqis pay far too much for the electricity from neighborhood generators and far too little for the electricity they get from the grid, which actually amounts for the majority of the supply that they consume. We estimate that neighborhood generators were paid around $4 billion for the services they provided in 2012, and that's 50% more than the Ministry of Electricity had to spend on capital projects on that year. This has led to a feedback loop where low revenue for grid supply means that the ministry has had to rely exclusively on the federal budget, so it's not had enough to invest, which in turn means consumers having to rely more and more on neighborhood generators, which are extremely costly. For Iraq's electricity sector to succeed and for the shortages in supply to be closed, this loop that's been going on for over a decade needs to be broken. So how can this be done? And what more can be done on the demand side? One of our first recommendations that we made to the Iraqi government is work towards reforming tariffs. This could include steps to remove subsidies to the most affluent consumers. Not only will this help bring crucial revenue to the electricity sector, which can then be reinvested into generation and the distribution networks, but it will lift some of the burden on the government budgets by stimulating the necessary private sector investment that is very much needed. Measures to remove subsidies will have the important effect of incentivizing more rational consumption of electricity and minimize the wasteful consumption. We looked closely at the existing tariffs and found that although they are in some ways progressive, they stop too early, and the more one consumes beyond 4,000 kilowatt hours per year, the less they're paying for 1 unit of electricity. The structure of the tariffs as they currently stand means that the biggest consumers of electricity today, the wealthiest who can afford the most appliances, are actually paying less per unit than they should. Expanding the number of tranches, corresponding to the higher levels of consumption would substantially increase the revenues for grid supply, which are necessary to reinvest in the sector, but it will also create a virtuous cycle by reducing the role of the neighborhood generators and therefore improving the affordability for households. This is fundamentally important. Tariff reform for the government-supplied grid is one aspect, but it has to be paired with stronger regulation of neighborhood generators. Currently, the tariff is set at 8,000 Iraqi dinars per ampere, but many are charging multiples of this. I have spoken to my dear friend Minister Lu'ay al-Khatib about this issue, and I am delighted that he and the government are moving to implement the difficult but necessary reforms that will make Iraq's electricity sector more reliable, more secure, and more affordable. The message I want to reinforce today, based on the IEA extensive experience in dealing with electricity reform across the world, is that there is no alternative to a holistic reform in Iraq. These were the changes that we highlighted as being essential in our deep study of the issue, which we released here in Baghdad in April. And I am confident that their successful implementation will lead to a far better electricity sector than today's. Successful reform will need to take into account the needs of society's most vulnerable and impoverished. There are ways to do this while at the same time ensuring that the customers are charged a fair price for the electricity they consume. Shifting the revenues from neighborhood generators to the national grid can result in lower overall household bills, while at the same time reinforcing the ministry with the capital it needs for the investments in generation, transmission, and distribution. Your Excellencies, esteemed guests, we at the international energy agencies have helped countries with similar reforms in the past and stand ready to help to continue supporting our Iraqi friends in this worthy path as that they have set themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ali Safa, for this heartening speech on the Iraq energy sector and the efforts the IEA would like to support in this country. We are coming to the end of this forum. I would like to invite Mr. Adnan al-Janabi to present a few awards to those who have supported this event and those who have honored us by being here. We will start with the first award, which will be presented to His Excellency Kamal Muhammad Saleh, the Minister of Electricity of the Kurdistan Regional Government. Mr. Adnan Janabi will present the award, of course. Thank you. Well, that was a thank you token to His Excellency Kamal Muhammad Saleh for being able of joining us here today and making the trip from the Kurdistan region. We will have a couple of extra thank you tokens that we are going to distribute to some of our generous partners and sponsors. The first one is going to be provided to Dana Ghaz, and the second one to Crescent Petroleum. May their representative approach the stage. Thank you. We would like also to thank our new sponsors who have decided to join us for the first time, Pagesco, an Egyptian company that have decided to take the trip from Cairo to Iraq and come to the Iraq Energy Forum. So Mr. Hisham may approach the stage and have a token of our appreciation. Thank you. So we have come to the end of this forum. Sorry, just one second. Right. So we have come to the end of this forum. We are quite pleased with the turnout. We're quite thankful also and appreciative of all the supporting organizations that we had. The International Energy Agency, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, and also the UNDP, UNESCO, Atlantic Council, and of course USAID. In addition, we're quite appreciative of all our partners that we had and also all the generous sponsors who contributed to the success of the 5th Iraq Energy Forum. Hopefully we will see you in 2020 in September, and we will meet each other again here in Baghdad under one roof. I'm going to ask all the teams who have been involved in the preparation and in the organization of this event to approach the stage for a group photo. Thank you very much. See you next year. Bye-bye.